Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for the Washington Post. Well, the June jobs numbers are out and they remain healthy. 209,000 jobs created. Unemployment ticked down 0.1% to 3.6%. This good economic news dovetails nicely with President Biden's new favorite word, Bidenomics. Joining me now to talk about whether the American people are willing to give him the credit for that is the chief correspondent for the Washington Post, Dan Balz. Dan, welcome back to First Look.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning to you.
Good morning. So the president and members of his cabinet have been crisscrossing the country touting Bidenomics. Here's what the president said yesterday in West Columbia, South Carolina.
I came to office determined, to the point of some of my own team thought I was too determined, to change the economic direction of this country, to move trickle-down economics and get rid of it for everyone, from the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, called the program Bidenomics. I'm not sure they meant it as a compliment at the time. Our plan is working.
That's a great message, but will it resonate with voters? Or put another way, why isn't he getting the credit he deserves on the economy?
Jonathan, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think one is partly it relates to the substance of the issue. He has a lot to talk about. I mean, they have significant accomplishments over the course of his presidency. The infrastructure bill, the semiconductor chips bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, which will pump hundreds of billions of dollars into climate-related investments. They have had steady job growth, more than 13 million jobs created during his presidency. They have a lot to talk about, and they have a lot that's in the pipeline that they hope people will begin to see. But there's another side to the economy that people are feeling, and that is that the inflation rate has remained stubborn. Yes, it has gone down over the last year, but it has not gone down enough that the Fed is still on watch and likely to continue to raise interest rates to push it down farther. And people feel that very directly when they go to the grocery store. Gas prices are down a bit again, but people are paying a fair amount at the pump. So it's those everyday costs that people feel in some ways more than they think about the jobs market. But the second part of this, Jonathan, I think is simply that in a polarized environment, President Biden is not likely to get considerable credit from at least half of the electorate for the state of the economy. And I think we see the stubbornness of those numbers. His economic approval numbers are very, very low. I mean, it's 2-to-1 negative on his economic approval. And in talking to people who are around the president, I mean, I think their belief is that that's not going to change very quickly, but they need to do what he has been doing, which is to go out and continue to make the case day in, day out, week in, week out.
And while he's making the case, Republicans aren't wasting time with their counter message. Republicans like Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, she's, let's just put this tweet. Oh, do we have the tweet? I'm just going to quote the tweet. She tweeted out, highest inflation in 40 years, 24 straight months of pay cuts, 37.2% increase in energy prices. That's Bidenomics in action. Is that the best Republican counter argument?
Well, to some extent, I think it is. I mean, I think when they talk about the inflation and put that in front of people, that can have an impact. And I think when we look at some of the survey research data on how people perceive the economy, at this point, despite the fact that there has been steady job growth over many, many months now, people don't think that the economy is in a very good place. And as you know, as the old saying goes, you can't tell people they should feel good if they don't feel good. So I think that the strategy of the administration is one in which they have to try to tell that story. And frankly, Jonathan, they've been trying to do that for a long time. They've been doing that for more than a year. It has had a minimal effect. They're going to put hundreds of millions of dollars behind advertising between now and election day, and most of it next year, to get that message out. And we'll see the extent that it has a significant impact. But again, in a country as divided as this country is, and with overall perceptions of the president fairly weak, that's a hard struggle.
And one of the other things that the administration and the president personally will be doing is racing around the country doing groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings due to infrastructure and all sorts of other things he's done. He's even said privately and publicly that he looks forward to going down to Marjorie Taylor Greene's district to break ground on a project pretty soon. Dan, let's talk about the Republican field for president. You had a column where you argued that if Florida Governor Ron DeSantis wanted to overcome his early stumbles to win the Republican nomination for president in 2024, he ought to follow the example of Barack Obama. Explain.
Yeah, this is kind of one of those heads explode cases. There's no comparison between Barack Obama and Ron DeSantis. Let's be clear about that. They are totally different human beings and totally different politicians. But what always has struck me, and particularly from the beginning of this Republican primary, is that the structure of the race bore some resemblance to the 2008 Democratic campaign, which is to say you had a relatively, large field. It's larger among the Republicans, but a relatively large field and a number of substantial people in that field. But basically, there were only two candidates who were at the top and separated from all of the rest. And in 2008, it was obviously Hillary Clinton, the favorite and the front runner, and Barack Obama, who came in with celebrity appeal and kind of a head of steam as the engaging, young, attractive candidate. You had something like that in the Republican race, where Donald Trump, clearly the favorite, clearly the dominant figure in the Republican Party, but Ron DeSantis coming off a very big win and heading into the primary. Now, in 2008, what many people forget is that Barack Obama was not a polished candidate at the beginning. He struggled. He had difficulty. He was grumpy on the campaign trail. He had difficulty connecting. And his team was very worried about that, not just through the spring, but well into the summer. I mean, there was a dinner that they had after a fundraising event, and a handful of his top advisors were there. And he said to them, okay, is this the intervention? Knowing that they were there to, tell him that he had to get better. And he recognized that the campaign was not operating at full capacity. He basically said, if we continue to operate the way we are, we're going to lose this race. And over a period of time and into the fall, he became a much better candidate. And not insignificantly, Hillary Clinton provided an opening by stumbling. In comparison, Ron DeSantis has had similar struggles. He has not proven to be the kind of candidate that many Republicans had hoped he would be. He has a message of, I would call it exclusion rather than inclusion. And his people skills are certainly not Barack Obama's people skills. But the question is, can he regroup? Can he find a way to get another gear in his campaign and begin to move forward? And secondly, is there anything that would dislodge support from former President Trump? And I think that's a big difference that could be between this race and the 2008 race.
Dan, I got to get you on one more thing in the less than minute that we have left. Speaking of former President Donald Trump, his fundraising numbers for Q2 are nuts. $35 million, which is more than he raised in Q1. How do any of I've lost track how many people are running for the Republican nomination, but how are they going to catch up, if not topple him as the front runner?
It's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, Governor DeSantis' team said that in the first 6 weeks of his candidacy, he raised $20 million, which is not shabby. Let's be honest. That's a pretty significant number. We don't know the details. We don't know kind of what the average contribution level is. We don't know how many people have maxed out. There are a lot of questions about that, but that's not a shabby number. But that's well behind what President President Trump has posted for this period. And again, going back to 2008, one of the things that sustained Barack Obama in that period is that he was equaling or and sometimes exceeding what Hillary Clinton was able to do, and so he was able to keep pace. But for all of the rest of the field, this is going to be an enormous challenge for them to try to match what Donald Trump is able to do. Now, you don't have to match it dollar for dollar. We know that from various campaigns, but you can't fall significantly behind. And we know that the other thing with Ron DeSantis and many of the others is they're relying heavily on super PACs, which can take huge contributions to do a lot of the work that traditionally has been done by the candidates' campaign staff.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, the question I have is, how much of that money is being used for the campaign, and how much of that money is being used for legal defense? But that's just a question I put out there for people to ponder over the weekend. Dan Balch, chief correspondent for the Washington Post, as always, thank you for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Jonathan. You too.
All right, we're going to keep the conversation going with the Opinions Roundtable in just a moment. Let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post associate editor and columnist Eugene Robinson and his First Look debut, Washington Post columnist Max Boot. Gene and Max, welcome to First Look.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good to be here.
So I want to continue the fundraising number conversation that I was just having with Dan. I mean, $35 million is a huge amount of money for Donald Trump to raise in the second quarter. It's double what he raised in the first 3 months of this year. Gene, I'll start with you. Are the indictments money makers for Donald Trump?
Well, first, Jonathan, I'll make the point that we're both old enough to remember when Donald Trump was such a rich billionaire that he was going to self-finance his campaign in 2016. Remember that? He wasn't even going to raise money. But in any event, look, it certainly looks as if the indictments have given him a boost in that they have energized the MAGA base. And, whether it goes beyond the MAGA base, which is a big chunk of the Republican Party, but not enough votes to reelect you president, maybe enough to get you the nomination. Whether it goes beyond that, I'll be interested to find out. But clearly, people who love Donald Trump seem to love him more now that he's an indicted felon.
Max, you have any thoughts on this?
Well, it makes me wonder what's going to happen if he's actually convicted. Is that going to put him over the top in the Republican primaries? I mean, it's kind of a disheartening phenomenon. It's one that we're pretty used to by now, but nevertheless, I mean, let's just pull back for a second and say, wow, this is pretty crazy. I mean, there's no way to spin this, I think, reasonably as a political persecution. I mean, this is clearly a candidate who has almost certainly violated the law and has been caught at it. And most Republicans are saying they don't care. And of course, this is coming on top of the fact that, Trump incited an insurrection. He was impeached twice. And again, most Republicans simply don't care. I mean, that's really a tragic commentary on my former party.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Gene, what did you make of Dan Baltz's column, his argument that if Ron DeSantis wants to prevail in his quest for the 2024 Republican nomination, that he should follow the roadmap set by one then Senator Barack Obama in 2008?
Well, look, I never argue with the political analysis of Dan Baltz, right? People have done that a long time, and they've been consistently wrong. So I do think that Dan makes an interesting point and an interesting parallel. The difference to me is that when Barack Obama did find his voice, it was that hopey, changey voice, as Sarah Palin called it. It was hope and change. It was an uplifting message. And I remember going out to Iowa before the caucuses that year and watching him deliver his by then finally honed stump speech to audiences. And they left these high school gymnasiums practically, floating out of the building. They were so energized and encouraged, and he made them feel good. Not Ron DeSantis doesn't at this point make anybody feel good, I don't think. I think his theory of the case that he can running to the right of Trump and being sort of Trumpier than Trump is going to be a winning formula for him. I think that's wrong. But so what is his sweet spot? What is his message that's going to let him connect if indeed he decides he needs to change things up? And I can't figure out what that is, but maybe he'll hit on something.
If I could just follow up very briefly, Jonathan, on Gene's excellent analysis, I would say two things. One, the DeSantis camp is way too plugged in online, and they get reactions on Twitter and other platforms by denouncing wokeness. But I think what they're finding is that average Republican voters are not nearly as worked up about wokeness as they are. And this is really a fringe issue in the Republican Party, which is not resonating even with most of the base. So I think they need to broaden their message beyond this culture war stuff, which has gotten out of control with their attacks on Disney, for example. And again, I think they're finding that a lot of Republicans like Disney too. So that's not necessarily going to be, and it's almost certainly not going to be a winning formula. But the other thing I would say is that, DeSantis also needs to figure out how he's going to actually attack Donald Trump. And so far, he's really refrained from doing it in a serious way. And I think his theory of the case, I would guess, is that he thinks that Trump will probably be convicted, and that will remove Trump from the race. And so as long as he doesn't offend Trump's followers, he can pick up some of that support naturally if Trump is knocked out of the race by the legal system, which is quite possible, but it's also quite possible that doesn't happen. So I think, DeSantis needs to stop playing it safe and needs to amp up his attempts to actually differentiate himself in a meaningful way from the Republican frontrunner before it's too late.
Yeah, I've always said that the big test for Governor DeSantis will be that first debate when he and Donald Trump are on the stage together, standing side by side, and Donald Trump goes Godzilla on him and breathes fire on him, and what's going to be his response. But Max, I want to switch gears and talk about Ukraine, because you had a recent column suggesting that those officials who are already writing off the Ukrainian counteroffensive as a failure are wrong. Why?
Well, remember, even before the start of the Desert Storm ground offensive in 1991, which is kind of held up as kind of the perfect offensive operation, one of the most lopsided victories in military history, even before the ground war started, there was something like 5 weeks of punishing airstrikes on Iraqi positions by U.S. and allied air forces. That's necessary to soften up the defenses before the ground troops go into action. Otherwise, they're going to suffer devastating casualties. Well, in the case of Ukraine, they don't have that air force that can inflict punishment from the air on the Russian forces. So they can't do the softening up from the air. What they have to do instead, a much more laborious and much more difficult process, is to try to soften up the Russian positions using ground-based systems like the Storm Shadow, for example, cruise missile that they've gotten from the UK, or the HIMARS multiple launch artillery systems they've gotten from the United States. It just takes a while, and I think that they are, proceeding very, very slowly and very deliberately because they don't want to suffer devastating casualties. That's something that Russian commanders don't care about. They don't care how many of their own men they lose. But the Ukrainians are fighting for a democracy. They care about casualties. And so they don't want to just advance willy-nilly into these minefields and Russian trenches and suffer horrifying losses. What they're trying to do is to sever the Russian supply lines to make it much more difficult for the Russians to keep their forces in the field. Then they're trying to probe for weaknesses in the Russian lines across 600 miles of front. And then, and only then, if they find those weaknesses, if they degrade the Russian supply lines, only at that point will they commit the bulk of their NATO-trained, NATO-armed forces, which so far are not in the battle. So it's been about a month since the Ukrainians started their initial offensive operations. I think we just have to be patient. As President Zelensky and others have said, this is not a video game. This is not something that's going to be over in 30 minutes. It could take months to move the front, even if it's going to have success. So I think we just need to give the Ukrainians time to roll out their plan and not, beat the drums for faster action, which could result in a lot of dead Ukrainians, which is the last thing anybody wants.
Mhm. And so, given what Max just said, Gene, we have a story on the front page of the Washington Post today that President Biden has approved cluster bombs for Ukraine, something that the Ukrainian president has been asking for. One, I would love to get your reaction about that approval, but also, if you could tie into that, whether you think Russian President Vladimir Putin will view this approval as a provocation, especially given the environment he's in after the Prigozhin rebellion. And we just find out that Prigozhin isn't in Belarus, he's in Russia still.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. To answer your second question first, I of course I think Putin will paint it as a provocation, even though I believe it's been reliably established that Russia has been using cluster munitions against Ukraine. They may deny that. Neither the United States nor Russia nor Ukraine is a signatory to a compact of many nations that have forsworn the use of cluster munitions, and the reason is not just that they are so deadly, but that a certain percentage of these cluster munitions, there could be dozens of little bomblets inside one shell, and a certain percentage will be duds, will not go off immediately, and will be unexploded ordnance that poses a grave risk to civilians in the weeks and months and years to come. So there's a whole issue that we deal with in our news department's excellent story this morning about the dud rate and whether the munitions that we are giving to Ukraine actually conform to U.S. law or not. But it is a complicated issue. I understand why Ukraine would need to use these kinds of munitions, but it is a complicated issue.
Can we talk about? I want to do a little. Well, no. Yeah, no, we are going to talk about NATO now. So next week, the president goes to Europe. There's a big NATO meeting in Lithuania. There was the expectation, Matt, that the occasion would be a welcome party for Sweden into the fold, just as happened for Finland a few months back. But Turkey still has objections to Sweden joining the security pact. What are those objections about?
That's a good question. It's a little bit hard to get a grip on it because it's hard to get any straight talk from Erdogan, the Turkish president / dictator. But basically, I think he objects that Sweden offers asylum to Kurds who he claims are terrorists, whereas the Swedes claim that they are political dissidents. So he wants a bunch of these Kurds deported to Turkey, where they're going to almost certainly wind up in prison. The Swedes are not willing to do that, and it's kind of an impasse. And there was an expectation that after Erdogan won his rigged re-election, that he would have more flexibility on this issue. But so far, that has not been forthcoming. But the expectation is still that, I think from U.S. officials, is still that that Turkey is basically in the Middle East carpet bazaar, and they're just they're kind of playing to increase the price that they will get for acceding to Sweden and NATO.
Gene, Punchbowl is reporting about a big meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee where the Republican Senator Jim Risch of Idaho used the occasion to go after not just Turkey, but Hungary for standing in the way of Sweden joining the NATO alliance. What's it going to take to move Turkey, particularly Turkey, off its anti-Sweden position?
Well, I don't think anyone knows yet exactly, because as Max said, we thought we knew what Erdogan's game was, and we thought he would be more flexible now, and he has not been. I believe he's still the major obstacle a much bigger obstacle than Hungary. I don't think we know his ultimate price. I think he does have a price, and I think the rest of NATO is determined to find out what that is and to get on with Sweden's accession. But it's, Erdogan is in charge of the clock here, and so we'll have to wait.
One other thing that Punchbowl is reporting is that the Biden administration, Max, is using the potential sale of F-16 fighter jets as a bargaining chip, basically saying, hey, Turkey, if you let Sweden in, we'll give you these fighter jets. And this is something that Senator Menendez, Robert Menendez of New Jersey, chair of the committee, has been blocking. Do you think that's a worthwhile thing for the administration to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to use all the levers that we have to get the Swedes in. There's no reasonable objection from Turkey to having Sweden join NATO. NATO is going to be strengthened by having Sweden as a member. And so, yeah, we should certainly use arms sales to Turkey as leverage to get Erdogan to drop his objections.
Hey, Max, one thing that Ukraine's going to be looking for at that NATO summit next week is security guarantees from the NATO countries. Will Zelensky get them?
Probably not in the form that he wants, because what the Ukrainians really want is a roadmap to join NATO, an assurance that they will become part of the alliance. And I think a lot of the Western European members and the US are nervous about doing that because they don't want to be drawn into a direct war with Russia, which is what the Article 5 collective security guarantee in NATO would imply. And so I think that the road that President Biden and other leaders are going down is to try to provide Ukraine with bilateral security guarantees that don't extend to Article 5. And I think that's a reasonable path to take. And I think we can use as a model our relationships with countries such as Israel and Taiwan, where we are pledged under law to provide them with the arms needed to defend themselves. And that's something we need to do with Ukraine, I think, because so far we've been aiding Ukraine on a very ad hoc basis. And there is a lot of concern around the world that, what happens if Republicans take the Senate? What happens if Donald Trump is back in the White House? Are they going to cut off aid to Ukraine? And I'm sure that's what Putin is hoping for. I think it's very important for Congress to pass legislation that commits us to providing Ukraine what it needs over the course of many years, at least 10 years, like we have these memorandums of understanding with Israel providing aid over the course of a decade. I think we need a memorandum of understanding with Ukraine that hopefully will be backed by both houses, and that will give some certainty to U.S. support. And I think that's a reasonable alternative to having Ukraine come into NATO, which I don't think is going to happen anytime in the near future, just because of the risk of being drawn into war with Russia.
Gene, we've got less than a minute left, but I would love 2 weeks ago today, and in the evening, that Friday evening, we started getting the first tweets and news about what we now call the Prigozhin Rebellion. I would just love your thoughts on Putin's standing today versus where it was 2 weeks ago today.
Well, it's diminished. I mean, you don't if you're Mr. All Powerful, the great leader, you don't allow a column of troops to go hundreds of miles into your country unopposed. So he is definitely diminished. Now, is this fatal to Putin or Putin's rule? I don't think it is. There's no indication it is. It's very interesting to learn over the last 24 hours that apparently Prigozhin is not in Belarus after all, that he's in Russia, that he's maybe in St. Petersburg. How I don't see how Putin and Prigozhin sort of coexist nicely at this point with that sort of open military challenge that Prigozhin presented to Putin. I don't see how this relationship lasts.
It's complicated. Eugene Robinson, Max Boot. Thank you both very much for coming to First Look. Have a great weekend.
You too.
You too, Jonathan.
Right. Head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more information about next week's interviews and to register. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.